Lesson 855, The Tortoise and the Hare, Interpreting Graphs of Functions. In this lesson, you'll explain the story told by the graph of a function and interpret points on the graph of a function. All right, we're on page 16 in your notebook, and honestly, if you haven't gone through the activity on Desmos for this lesson, I'd go ahead and do it. It's really kind of fun. It's a bunch of different animals racing and just showing the animation of the race and comparing it to the graph of the same race. We actually have 3 learning targets today, but we're just going to write down 2 of them, save 1 of them for the summary at the end. First of all, we need to be able to explain the story told by the graph of a function. Explain the story told by the graph of a function. Still working with functions here. And secondly, be able to interpret points on the graph of a function. We'll do both of those things here in a moment. I spelled that wrong, I think. No, maybe not. Interpret points on the graph of a function. So in the activity, there were a bunch of animals racing, but for our notes here, we just have a temperature over the course of 12 hours in a day. So this graph shows the temperature between noon and midnight on one day. Whenever we're presented with a graph, it's important to look at what these 2 labels for the x-axis and the y-axis represent to help understand what's going on. So the x-axis represents the time in hours after noon. So 0 hours after noon would be, well, noon. Then 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, all the way until midnight. That's what the x-axis represents. And the y-axis is showing the temperature over that period of time and how it changes in degrees Fahrenheit. It looks like they're starting at 51 degrees. Put a little lightning bolt there so we know we've skipped from 0 to 51 for the purposes of our graph. So this graph actually tells the story of the temperature on this day. I can tell that it starts at about, I'm going to say 50 degrees, that it goes up for a few hours, looks like at about 6 hours total, from 0 hours to 6 hours, and then starts going back down. But it doesn't get down to where it started by the time we get to midnight. So let's jot down a few little details about what's happening in this graph. We can say the temperature at noon is about 50 degrees. That's where we start here. We can say it gets warmer for about 6 hours, or I should say the temperature increases for about 6 hours. About 6 hours. And I'm going to take a moment and talk about this point in time. This point in time, if I were going to write it as coordinates, well, I'm going to fudge a little bit here and say this is the point 6:59. Both of those numbers mean something, and I should be able to interpret their meaning. The first number is the hours after noon. So that's going to be 6 hours after noon, or 6 o'clock p.m. And the second number is the y value, the temperature, in degrees Fahrenheit. So to continue my story, I'm going to talk about that peak temperature. So the temperature increases for about 6 hours and peaks at 59 degrees at 6 o'clock. And let's go ahead and finish by what happens after that. Then the temperature decreases at a slower rate until midnight. Then the temperature decreases at a slower rate until midnight, and then we don't know what happens. And I can tell that it's decreasing at a slower rate because this line isn't quite as steep as this piece of the line. I know they're not, straight lines, but on average, this one's going up faster than this one's going down. It's covering more temperature in a shorter amount of time. So let's answer some questions about this graph, just to get some practice at making sense of the story being told by that graph. So first of all, did the temperature change more between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. or between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m.? So both of these are 2-hour spreads of time. So 1 p.m. is here, 1 hour afternoon, and 3 p.m. is, well, here's 3 o'clock, and I'm going to come up to the graph right there. So here's the part of the graph where the temperature is increasing. So let's look at how much that temperature changed. I'm going to do a little bit of rounding here. I'm going to say it started at about 50 degrees. 1 o'clock was about 50 degrees, and 2 hours later, it was about 55 degrees. So that's a change of 5 degrees. Let's take a look at what happens from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Again, we're still just talking about 2 hours. Here's 7 o'clock, and here's 9 o'clock. And there's what's happening. So from 7 to 9, at 7 o'clock, it looks to be about 58 degrees. And at 9 o'clock, that moment in time looks like about, well, it's between 55 and 56. So I'm going to say that at 9 o'clock, it's about 55.5 degrees. So it's come down this time. We've lost about 2.5 degrees. So over that same 2 hours, the temperature didn't change as much as it did over these 2 hours. In fact, it changed about twice as much here than it did here. Here it changed 5 degrees, here it changed 2.5 degrees. And I can tell in the graph that there was a faster change as well, because this part is steeper than this part. Let's move on to another question. Was it warmer at 3 o'clock or at 9 o'clock? Let's get some different pens here. At 3 o'clock or at 9 o'clock? Well, let's go and see what the temperature was at each of those times. So 3 p.m., I'm going to come along this axis again. This is the hours afternoon. So 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. So that's between 54 and 55 degrees. So I'm going to say 54.5 degrees at 3 o'clock. And let's look at it at 9 o'clock. So here's 9 o'clock, 9 hours afternoon. And this graph looks like we're right about here when we hit our graph. And that is between 55 and 56 degrees. So I'm going to say about 55.5 at 9 o'clock. So when was it warmer? Well, it wasn't much warmer, but at 9 o'clock we can read that it's about 1 degree warmer. That's when it was warmer. So as long as we look at these labels, we can make sense of the story that this graph is telling us. I said there was a third learning target, and it was about how can you tell when a function is increasing or decreasing. It seems pretty obvious to me, but we're going to go ahead and nail it down anyway. It's increasing when the graph is going up, and it's decreasing when the graph is going down. But I want to make sure I say one extra thing. We have to be looking at the graph from left to right, just like we'd read a book. From left to right, if the graph is increasing, it's going up. And from left to right, if it's decreasing, it's going down. So one last time, let's just go back to this graph. And as I move from left to right, I see that this graph is increasing here, up until about 6 o'clock, and still moving from left to right, it's decreasing here. All right, so this is all about how a graph can tell a story.